Welcome, everybody, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Garin. I'm the CEO of Image Nation Abu Dhabi in 2454, and I'm really happy to welcome you to our first screening series in partnership with the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. We have a great turnout for tonight's screening event with guests from around the world, including Brazil, the Seychelles, Luxembourg, Italy, France, the United States, and the UK. It's really a global event. To give you some background, Image Nation is an Academy Award-winning media and entertainment company based in the UAE and been working closely with the Office of Public and Cultural Diplomacy at the Ministry for the last few years to use our content as tools for the UAE's public diplomacy efforts. Throughout this monthly series, we're going to be looking at the role of cultural diplomacy in the UAE through Image Nation's documentary films, which covers topics as diverse as wildlife conservation, women's education, developmental disorders, and as we saw this evening, the polio crisis in Pakistan. Each session will be joined by a panel of experts to spark an in-depth conversation on the film's content and its role for the UAE. This evening, as we watch Every Last Child, the 2014 documentary, it was directed by Tom Roberts and produced by the Crown Prince Court of Abu Dhabi and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You saw that it details the polio crisis in Pakistan and its humanitarian dimension. The film premiered at the renowned film festival, New York, and went on to screen around the world, including at the UN, the World Health Organization, the European Union, and UAE embassies around the world. Joining me this evening, I'm very happy to welcome His Excellency Omar Saif Ghobash, who's the Assistant Minister of Public and Cultural Diplomacy at the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, and Nassar Al Mubarak, Senior Director at the Office of Strategic Affairs in the Crown Prince Court of Abu Dhabi, who is also the Executive Director of the film. If you have any questions for either of our panelists, please use the Q&A function that you see on, hopefully you see on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and join and add to our discussion. So let me begin with Omar. The global effort to end polio is a partnership of a lot of organizations around the world, including the UAE and the Gates Foundation, as well as the Pakistani government. We're seeing a similar need for countries and global organizations to collaborate during this time, and the UAE has been one of the leading providers of foreign aid to countries in this current pandemic. Why does the UAE care about health care and health situation in other countries? Why does this matter to the UAE?
Very well. Thank you very much, Michael, for hosting us and asking that question, and great to see you, Nassar. And here's a lesson for everybody who heard me earlier on. When you think that you are completely private, speak as though the world can hear you, because it turns out the world can hear you. I'm glad we didn't take that conversation any further, Nassar. Alhamdulillah. Yeah, so when it comes to the UAE, I'm actually right now somewhere in the western province, and right in the middle of the desert. It's absolutely stunning. And we watched the sunset, and I was asking one of the people there who's in the know whether his older generations would have looked at the same sunset with the same appreciation of the beauty, given the hardship that they were living in. You know, from lack of access to food and water. And to be honest, his answer was, yes, they would have seen the beauty, and we can tell that from the poetry that we've you know, sort of inherited from that time. And there really is a concept of beauty there. But he also went on to tell me about the stories of how at some time people would actually end up eating dead animals because they were so hungry. If you lived beyond a certain age, well, then you were really blessed, because most people died at a very early age, a very young age. And so I think it's that spirit of having survived and having seen some of the most brutal kind of living conditions that prompted His Highness Sheikh Zayed in the 50s and 60s, Allah yarhamah, to go out and start giving out money from the first kind of oil revenues. And that's very much in the spirit of the Emirates, a memory of hardship and a recognition that others in hardship need to be assisted. So that there's a long tradition of the Emirates giving and supporting other countries in sort of dire situations. And when it comes specifically to the pandemic, or to polio and the pandemic, on the pandemic at the moment, we've seen the Emirates. I mean, the last time I looked at the numbers, we'd already given aid to 43 different countries. That again is in the spirit of giving. The fact is that we have these astounding logistical and trading operations in the country, which allows us to access the kind of equipment and material needed to assist countries that can't. We have the know-how. We can actually transport these things logistically to different places, and we're blessed with a certain amount of resources that allows us a surplus that allows us to give it out. It's good politics, but it's also something that is intrinsic to the nature of the Emirates. Why does it care about other countries? Apart from just caring, especially when it comes to pandemics, it makes us remember that actually we are completely dependent upon one another. And there's been a lot of talk about the weakest link. And clearly this is a great argument against the massive inequality that we see in the world. If we can't take care of the most disadvantaged, it's quite likely that the most advantaged will suffer just as well. So there is an element, I think, of global self-interest in tackling this problem.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
And we see societies behaving and responding so differently in different countries around the world. How do you see the impact that a health crisis like polio or COVID-19 has on society and people's behavior and on their attitudes, both around the world and here at home?
Well, this is still an ongoing discussion. It's my observations on this change every day, as I'm sure it does for many other people, and the different kinds of scenarios that we kind of plotting out. I think in our own personal space, we're sitting thinking, well, our country is going to collapse, our economy is going to collapse. What then happens? And it's very difficult to extrapolate what happens after that. There is clearly an issue, a class issue, where it seems, at least in Western societies, the wealthy can protect themselves, and those who need to go to work have to go to work and will face the disease. So that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in Western societies. In our part of the world, very difficult to tell, because we have disparities of wealth in the region, but we've also got some very, very focused government intervention trying to help everybody in our communities. So overall, I think it's a question of choice. You can allow yourself to be taken with the most negative views, but I think that this is really an opportunity to reach out to others, whether it's internally within the state or across borders. And it is a choice that we can make to appeal to our partners across the region. So I think we have an opportunity to make a clear stand. And we've got to help each other through the tough times too, because tough times will be coming.
Yes, and I've always felt, on just a personal note, that whether it's personal character or national character, it's only truly revealed at the extremes of good fortune or real tragedy. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is the fact that we've revealed our character both as a nation and as people, being responsible for ourselves and each other in a way that very few others can really look to with pride.
I think if I could just add, I mean, at the local level here in the Emirates, there's also been a massive recognition of the importance of the sciences. We've always paid lip service and tribute to the sciences, but we really are beginning to understand that we've got to localize these skills. But it's not just the sciences as sort of a base for research, but also to be scientific in your approach and scientific in your method of dealing with problems. And if you compare what certain countries very publicly did initially with the crisis, and the idea of herd immunity and so on, there is a science also to all of the policy making that has been taking place. And I think we're very fortunate that we had more than one source of of guidance and information, and the fact that we already had a very, very well-established emergency reaction team that could actually handle it. So I think in a sense, that's going to have an effect going forward on the way in which government looks at its own function and at the broader community. And I think we've also heard that there will be a re-examination of how government functions in the next few weeks.
Yeah. And as someone who always says I'm not from the United States, I'm from New York, it's also very nice to be living in a place with an educated population that actually believes in science.
Yes, you're right.
So now let me turn to Nassar. And the CBC has a lot of tools to communicate at its disposal. How did you choose a film or documentary to convey this message about polio?
So as I'm sure you've learned, Michael, from the many years of living in the UAE, that storytelling is an integral part of our heritage. Generations of Emiratis have used storytelling to bridge divides, share moral lessons, and recall the struggles and triumphs of our ancestors. We recognize the power of stories to educate, connect, and inspire. But it's also important to say that many people around the world don't know that polio still exists. So in order to be successful in our eradication efforts, we need to reach beyond the global health space and educate the average person about polio and why the work is so important. We've seen time and time again that films are a great way to tell stories, and Every Last Child allowed the larger audience to experience the plight of polio on a very human level. The film allowed us to go beyond the facts and figures and share real stories of people, from the frontline health workers risking their lives to administer these needed vaccines, to the scientists so hard at work, and most importantly, the children whose lives may be forever changed because they received these vaccines.
Thanks so much. And in the film, we saw that the UAE is a major supporter of polio eradication. And but to tell us a little more about the role that the UAE plays in that work, and why is it particularly involved in Pakistan?
Sure. So the UAE, as you know, Michael, has a long history of philanthropy and humanitarian support, and not only in Pakistan, but across the world. This history has been rooted by our founding father, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, and this legacy has been preserved by His Highness Sheikh Khalifa, the President of the UAE, and His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. He's a big supporter of global health issues such as polio. Since 2011, His Highness has personally committed and pledged more than $320 million and has mobilized the UAE's unique resources and expertise on the ground in Pakistan. This has been done through the Emirates Polio Campaign, which has brought the vaccine and aid to remote regions that were previously unreachable. Today, this campaign reaches nearly 16 million children in Pakistan every month and has so far since 2014 delivered more than 450 polio vaccines. The campaign has also mobilized more than 105,000 community health workers with a big emphasis on empowering women in their communities, as at least half of these frontliners are women, which provides them with a source of income and also strengthens the skills of the local health workforce. Michael, I think it's also important to note that the Emirates Polio Campaign works in tandem with the UAE's Pakistan Assistance Program, which delivers food aid, builds schools, and leads critical infrastructure projects in remote areas of Pakistan. Together, these programs underpin the UAE's holistic approach to improving lives, and not just by addressing health, but education and other development challenges as well.
Thank you so much. And Omar, you've written a great deal about and spoken about extremism. We saw in the film this evening that gentleman who ran the food stand. There's no doubt in my mind that he loves his children as much as all the other people in that film. And yet he was unwilling to have his children protected with the vaccine. How do you think these crises create the conditions for radicalism? And do you see this happening anywhere in the world at the moment? And is this a increasing trend, or what are you thinking about this?
Well, Americans don't have a monopoly on anti-vaxxers. Anti-vaxxers are all over the world. So Yeah, I've actually in the recent past met some very interesting, intelligent people who say that they would be hesitant to take a COVID vaccine, which really surprised me. So there are people out there who have their doubts. I think one of the important things is that in a Muslim context, when these programs are used to incite people to pick out their phobias, their fears, their paranoias, all of the things that they're worried about, I think it really is unfair. But I also think that, you know, that countries like the Emirates can really contribute to changing the perception of what is essentially Western science. So I think that's one thing, and that's why I think what the Emirates is doing and Abu Dhabi is doing in playing the part of a global citizen and engaging at the highest levels in a global fight against disease, that this will then help kind of legitimize programs like the polio eradication. I'm sure that people will, I mean, radicals look for opportunities in any situation. COVID is a particularly ripe opportunity for those who want to manipulate situations. So I wouldn't be surprised if something came up. But, you know, we've now been watching the spread of radicalization and extremism for at least 40 years. We are more prepared to deal with those types of people. And I think there's much greater awareness of, you know, the kinds of buttons that they press. So do I see radicalization rising? It's an open question. It's very, very difficult to tell. It's still too early. But I think we need to be prepared anyway for that.
And having watched this documentaries and some of our outreach activities, do you think that these things like documentaries and films have an important role to play in both our public diplomacy and addressing the issues of extremism, or people so convinced of their positions they make us feel good for producing them, but have little impact for their intended audiences?
Michael, I feel like you're fishing for compliments here.
No, I'm not. It's a genuine question, honestly.
You know, what could I say? Of course, you're doing a great job. These are these are amazing documentaries, amazing films. I would only suggest that maybe we need to make sure that the distribution is even greater, because these are really important stories that they may reflect positively on the Emirates. They may be ignored, but they need to be out there, because I mean, there are so many people who would change their view of what Arabs and Muslims are doing if they could understand that actually, you know, there are global thinkers and there are countries that are leading at a global level, and entering into this kind of universal debate about healthcare for everybody, not just their own particular ethnic or religious minority. So yeah, I think, you know, it is not a thankless task. We all thank you for this beautiful film. And I'd highly recommend, yeah. And if there's anything we can do in our humble public diplomacy department to promote them, we're ready to do that.
Well, that's very kind. It's actually not the compliments, but what you said about distribution is actually music to my ears, because my origins in this industry are from distribution. And
yeah.
From my early days, the view in Hollywood and the States was people of talent and ability made films, and the lower lives like me sold and distributed them. But I always tried to make the point that it doesn't matter how good the content is if nobody sees it.
Right.
And one of the things we've tried to do, and I would say to the audience here, is that there's a whole career path for people to get involved in the distribution and the marketing and the promotion of films. And that's as critical a part of our industry as the making of them. So, you know, anybody who's interested in that, we have opportunities for you, and I would encourage you to explore them with us.
Well, could I add that, you know, if even locally more Emiratis were able to see what their own government is doing, they would be surprised, and they might even see an opportunity for them to get to participate, because these are clearly very important and very large-scale programs. There's a tremendous amount of international experience to be gained, a lot of kind of intercultural work to be gained. And you know, for those, I know that we have a large young population that wants to volunteer for things. It wants to do good. They want to go out and make a difference. These are particularly important ways in which they can do that. And by casting a light and actually telling a story around it, you create a very, very powerful narrative that I think should be more widespread.
Yeah. And the other thing that I would say is more widespread is that the audience is seeing three individuals on the screen representing three separate organizations. And
Yeah.
one of my frustrations in the 14 years I've been in Abu Dhabi was that for a long time, the leadership allowed and invested billions of dollars to create these world-class organizations, and they lost hundreds of millions of dollars in potential synergies because people built themselves into silos. And now, for a whole variety of reasons, I see that changing. Their financial pressures, obviously, the luxury of isolated organizations no longer really viable. And also, I think we're just getting better at managing ourselves. But that's the other thing that I see and encourage is that, you know, it's not only people talking among themselves within the organization, but people working together across organizations. And that's, I think, something that is occurring more frequently and gives me a great deal of hope and optimism.
Michael, can I say that that was actually a discussion that we were having earlier this evening around the idea of work and credit, the cooperation between different departments and who gets credit. And the reality is that I know I had nothing to do with this project. And I know that both of you actively worked on the project. But I don't want to get credit. I want to take part in taking pride publicly about these issues. So for me, it's really an honor to be able to sit here with you and with Nassar. You guys have done the hard work. All I'm doing is saying I really think it's amazing. So I agree with you. There are an immense amount of synergies between departments, but I also think that it's a global issue. You know, you'll find the same kind of departmental battles in the UK, the US, Russia, and China. But it would be great if we in the Emirates could figure out mechanisms to build cooperation between these silos. And it might be simple software changes in our management systems, or it could be, you know, sharp stick. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But well done for pointing it out.
This brings me back to Nassar, because you're facing the same challenge in your role at the CPC because you're dealing with a lot of international organizations at the same time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and the challenges and the successes and the disappointments that you're experiencing in this role?
So let me give you a bit of a bright note when we talk about polio and the collaboration in polio eradication. Polio cases have dropped by 99% worldwide since 1988. And there's a risk of this disease returning in large numbers if we're not vigilant. One of the biggest challenges is keeping the international community focused on eradication, which is why advocacy efforts such as Every Last Child are so critical to our mission. The last mile to eradication is always the hardest, and the approaches and tools that have worked previously in curbing the spread of polio are no longer as effective. Till today, the only disease in mankind that has been eradicated is smallpox, and hopefully polio will share the same fate. But that can only be done with a deep level of commitment and partnership, as each partner brings their own unique resources and expertise to the table. The UAE, for example, works very closely with the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, which is a public-private partnership of organizations committed to ending polio, as well as the government of Pakistan in the work on the ground. So just last year, the GPI hosted, under His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed's patronage, a global polio pledging moment in Abu Dhabi, whereby partners have pledged more than $2.6 billion to achieve the polio endgame strategy. These are just some examples of how global collaboration can be so effective, and that it's needed to overcome the barriers that we face today in polio eradication.
Okay, that's great. And let me ask you now some of the questions that we're getting from the people watching. And thank you for staying with us. I was so impressed that virtually everybody who started watching the documentary finished, and so many of you joined us afterwards.
Michael, they do know that they get a cash prize for staying to the end, right?
And a certificate, apparently. There's a question I want to direct to Nassar, and then Omar can help him out. But are you afraid that the negative economic outlook will reduce the cultural production and activities that projects like this represent?
So, I mean, Michael, I think it's that's a very difficult question, but I think it's a very ripe one, because definitely polio sort of efforts, as well as other sort of efforts, have been derailed by the current COVID crisis. Unfortunately, the communities that are affected by polio are the same communities that will most be impacted by COVID-19. COVID-19 is expected to overwhelm the poorest and most vulnerable communities. The World Bank global poverty rates, the World Bank has just announced that they expect global poverty rates to rise for the first time since 1998. Many central programs for polio, as we said, have been put on hold. To divert resources towards the virus, field activity has been postponed, and it's become more difficult to secure frontline workers, as it also puts them at risk of contracting COVID-19. That being said, I think we need to continue to increase public awareness that polio is still a threat in these parts of the world and can directly impact global health. I think it's also important for us to communicate the larger impact of investing in infrastructure programs, such as the Emirates Polio Campaign, emphasizing the role of the frontline workers. Now more than ever, we're reminded of their critical role and their bravery, even as they face risks to their own safety and health while on the job. Once this sort of infrastructure is established, it will increase the resilience of these communities and help in strengthening their healthcare systems, which can further be utilized, obviously, to support communities across various diseases and health issues.
Okay, thank you. And but also, could you talk a little bit about collaborating with other organizations? So many of these problems require a consortium, and building consensus is hard enough inside our national borders or any national borders, but building a consensus across borders is even a bigger challenge. Could you share some of your experience in getting everybody first to the table and then around the table?
Sure. So, I mean, the example of polio, I think we're lucky to have that sort of coordination on a global scale. And although it's sometimes not at the top of the agenda where we'd like it to be, I think the infrastructure that has been built to support polio eradication is something that can be obviously used in other sort of programs and to tackle other global health issues. I think the consortium such as the Global Polio Eradication Initiative is a great example of that, where you have people such as the WHO, the Gates Foundation, UNICEF, and so on, all coming together to the table and strategizing, and each one really knowing how they can best leverage their organization to support this effort.
Right. And you know, Teddy Roosevelt had walk softly or speak softly and carry a big stick. Omar, can you, you know, we have a big stick, but we also speak softly. That presents opportunities and challenges. Could you just give us a sense of, you know, you're in the field as Nassar is, and I think it's a unique opportunity for people to hear somebody like you to actually talk about their everyday real life experiences. That would be very valuable.
I'm sure, if it's valuable, then we can discuss that in a future session. You know what I found very interesting, Michael, is that Nassar and I heard your question differently. And it's just another lesson in the fact that everybody has his own perspective. I heard a very different question, and what I heard was you asking whether, with the economic effects of COVID, are we still going to have cultural production? Are we going to have things like Image Nation, documentaries, and so on? And for me, I actually think this is the only thing left for us to do. I mean, we can't go out and build buildings. We can't go out and, you know, sort of promote tourism. Well, not in the old style. And in fact, specifically in the Emirates, we have such astounding infrastructure, physical, legal, financial infrastructure, that actually now is the time to think of how do we fill that with more content than ever. And given the fact that most people are now living online, just imagine the amount of creativity that we could unleash if we're not distracted by these more mundane physical aspects of the world. So I'm sure that funding is going to be affected right across the board, but in turn, everything else becomes cheaper anyway. I mean, real estate is going to suffer, and therefore rents have to at some stage come down. That's one basic. Yeah. So I'm very optimistic about cultural production, because COVID in itself is such a shock and emotional, specifically an emotional shock to many people, that there will be an increased interest in how to describe the world, how to imagine future worlds coming out of this. I mean, what do we tell our children? I mean, I have this issue of my children thinking that everything is going to be normal in the next few weeks. And the reality is no adult knows if they can say that honestly. So yeah, I think we're in for an incredibly creative time. And I think it's up to places like Image Nation to be able to provide the space and the opportunities for young men and women to do that, to take it up.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things that has occurred since this film was produced is the proliferation of new media forms. Thinking particularly of social media. And we are expanding the range of our activities to include these forms. We're starting a program to teach people how to produce for social media, so that we can both expand the range, but also the access, giving people a voice. Right now, basically everything we do is speaking on their behalf. But I think the real successful communication and the great leap forward for the society is, I date myself, but in the 50s and 60s, we had a program called People to People. And that was a direct personal exchange, sending people abroad, inviting people to come visit. But now we really have the opportunity for an entirely new people-to-people program through social media and other forms. And so that's, I think, going to be very important to the future.
Well, if I can just say, because our communication now is next to, next to having no price whatsoever, it is essentially free. The question will be then, how interesting can you make these conversations? How do you actually, now the valuable commodity is people's time. Do you watch a film on polio, or do you go and watch something on Netflix, or do you go and play tennis?
Exactly.
If you can? So,
and that's an interesting observation, because it goes back to one of the challenges that we have, which is providing the same kind of discipline training that would exist if people were growing up in the United States or the UK or in China, where there are very well-established industries. There are mentorships, there are internships. But when you don't have an industry, it's still quite nascent here. How do you provide all those opportunities? I always use the example that I'm a terrible skier, but I'm a decent tennis player and a golfer. Why is that? Because when I was young and in high school, I was quite athletic, and I went to on a ski holiday with my high school senior friends who had been skiing for a number of years. I went for the first time. I went to the top of the mountain. I was young, I was athletic, and I didn't want to be on the baby slope, so I skied down with them, but my own way. And by the time I realized this was a great sport, I developed so many bad habits, it didn't make any difference how many lessons I had. Whereas when I took tennis and golf lessons from the beginning, even 70 years later or 65 years later, my muscle memory and my abilities are the same. And it's no different with filmmaking. We have seen people who produce a YouTube video, and they get hundreds and thousands of views and likes. And then they come to us and want to produce a film or a television program. They think they're Cecil B. DeMille, and they're not even ready for prime time. But this is a challenge that we hope that we can overcome with our training programs for social media. That what you said is exactly the point. It's the medium and it's the message, and we're going to try to help people become as professional in creating short content as more lengthy ones. I have a few questions that you can answer, and I will try to answer as well, because they're the same subject but different fields. How can a fresh graduate become a diplomat?
Watch me every time I appear on Zoom, number one. That'll be a good training. Number two, Michael, I wanted to say I had no idea that you and I were the same age. Really remarkable.
Yeah, I'll be 74 in July.
How can somebody become a diplomat? It's, you know, how can somebody work for government is the big question right now. Since government is going to be reinventing itself very, very quickly. And I actually think that many of the silos in terms of job descriptions will begin to disappear. And you will find that what was a diplomat is now an expert in a particular field who is called on to deal with a specific issue at a specific time. We're going to become much more flexible in diplomacy. We're going to be much more focused as well. It's, you know, as the world changes, and we need to watch whether it becomes more multilateral or whether it begins to focus much more on bilateral survival of the fittest type relations. That in turn will change the nature of diplomacy and the kinds of people that we're going to need. I think generally, not just as a diplomat, but to succeed in the Emirates economy and society, you're going to need to think of yourself as playing at a global level. You're going to need to judge yourself according to the highest educational standards, ethical standards, and standards of learning. Do not compare yourself to your neighbor. Compare yourself to the best in the world, whether in New York or in Beijing. And I think if you have that mentality, then you can be a diplomat. You can be much more than a diplomat.
Okay, that's a very diplomatic answer.
I thought I was being clear. That's, no, absolutely.
Just making sure. So I think it's time to wrap up. There are some very good questions that I've not had time to address. I will try to address them either on the links and also just to not compliment with a I, but compliment with an E. Omar's answer. If you are interested in entry level opportunities or any kind of opportunities in film and television, social media, etc., if you go to the Image Nation page, there's a contact us link, and if you get in touch with us, I promise we'll get back in touch with you.
Michael, could I say just a quick word? Firstly, I'd like to say thank you so much for hosting us, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to chat on a lonely evening. But also, I want to, as I hand over to Nassar, I did notice there was a question, Nassar. Tell us about the painting behind you. More than one person has asked for that information. And you know, I asked you before we went on as well. So I think we can end on a very, very beautiful note there.
Great. Well, thank you. So the painting is from this amazing Iraqi artist. Her name is Yusra. And I think, I mean, if you can see the painting, it's quite playful. It's quite energetic. And I think that's what we all need at this point.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Alma and Mahmoud for organizing this. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, because this is really a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Okay. Thank you for hosting us.
Thanks, everybody. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.